I am a fan of games on their original hardware. Despite this, I came to emulators fully aware of their value. Strictly speaking, being jobless on a shoestring budget and a burgeoning anti-capitalist ideologue in college will highlight that value without even a second thought. But from that point, I moved backwards. I reverted back from the tech head's obsession with trying to make all manner of emulators work on my PC into the romantic's desire to return to those same consoles that the emulators were merely copying. I am not really much of a collector of anything. I have collections, but always have a stopping point that prevents true obsession. I stopped getting trading cards when the new cards became mundane to me. Games stopped when I ran out of immediate shelf space. Clothes at least slowed down when my closet and drawers became overly cluttered. Albums when the burden of the physical media space became too cumbersome to justify. Video game consoles must earn my respect to stay present. Because of this, my penchant for the kitsch and warm familiarity of the original game hardware has to be squared against my distaste for the retro game market as it currently exists. Answers came to me in part because I spent time searching them out. EverDrive make top-of-the-line flashcards. This is not an endorsement. EverDrive has not sponsored me, believe it or not. I'm just talking off the cuff about them. EverDrive make top-of-the-line flashcards, even for consoles for whom such a thing was not really available before, such as the Nintendo 64. The X-Station is an incredible hardware modification to the original PlayStation that replaces the often faulty Laserdisc with a micro SD card slot. The PlayStation 2, ever temperamental as it may be, has an exploit through memory cards that allows the launching of a custom firmware on the machine without a cracking of the machine itself. This custom firmware allows the USB slots on the front to be used as God intended. The Wii's Nintendo program allows for an easy and function-loaded build of GameCube emulation that doesn't have me anchored to my computer the way a Dolphin does. The Sega Dreamcast is itself its own solution to the question I was toying with. Do you have a disk drive? And do you have disk burning software? Enjoy your Dreamcast collection, and if you have a disk wallet, you have figurative shelf space for your physical media. Congratulations. But there was something else to this upholding of the value of old hardware, and I discovered it vis-a-vis the Sega Genesis. I had given away a Sega Genesis I had gotten pre-retro game media shelf of YouTubers. Boom. But I was compelled to keep one controller. Something told me that I could probably make use of this. I kept on my modified Nintendo Wii from 2006 the Genesis Plus GX emulator and a collection of WAD files of Genesis games that were provided through a now defunct Wii Virtual Console service. In a word, I have Genesis games. I have an original Genesis controller, too. Certainly, my two separate Wii Classic controllers would suffice to perform the act of playing any and all Sega Genesis games, and on top of that, the second version of the Wii Classic controller with handles and further spaced out analog sticks would be infinitely more comfortable than the deformed boomerang of the original 3-button Genesis gamepad that I owned. The higher functions of my brain, those married to reason and concerned with sense, acknowledge how outmoded and outclassed the Sega Genesis controller is and has been for a long time. But again emerged the pernicious romantic in me, enamored with authenticity, plump with the imagination of how these games are meant to be experienced, and strangest of all, harboring a quiet affection for the Genesis's dumbass boomerang. And in my $25 purchase of a RAFnet Mega Drive /SMS controller to Wiimote adapter V2, I found within me a hidden truth. I love janky video game controllers. I love them, and I miss them. By the way, this is the aforementioned RAFnet product. As we see, it plugs into the bottom of the Wiimote, and then suddenly we can take a Sega Genesis controller, plug it right in just like that, and yes, it does work. I've used it plenty of times. It's my preferred way to actually play Sega Genesis games at this point, by using all this rigmarole, as it were. Let's talk a little history. Games need gamepads. It doesn't matter if your game is Dwarf, Fortress, or Pong. Requiring the full range of input provided by a keyboard and mouse, or something so simple that the commands of up and down map to a couple of buttons, or even just a singular stick, would suffice. The very factor of interactivity that is integral to games of all stripes necessitates a medium through which that interactivity can be conducted. As games got more complex, the gamepads got more complex in kind. The history of games as a medium can be gleaned cursorily through examining only gamepads, and I can prove this. This is an Atari 2600 controller, not a real one. You can obviously tell this is one of those TV plug-and-play atrocities from the 2000s that ran on batteries, and you would plug into the AV ports on your TV, on your television set, plug in these cables right there, and then you would play some Atari games on it. But it's relatively true to form. This is a genuine Atari product. You can tell because this stick doesn't move. This is an Atari 2600 controller. I do not have a Nintendo Entertainment System controller because the NES sucked, but I do have an equivalent. And this, as we can see, this is the gamepad, as it were, of the Game Boy Color. And as we see, we have two buttons, D-pad. That's all. There's nothing on the back. Completely blank. We go a little bit forward from one button and a stick to a D-pad and two buttons and two more buttons. So we're progressing forward in time. We have our favorite aforementioned stiff-wired boomerang atrocity right here. 3 buttons on the front, 1 D-pad, and a start button. So one more primary face button than the Nintendo Entertainment System or Game Boy Color, but still, as we can tell, quite simplistic in terms of its makeup and its design. 2 years after the Sega Genesis, we had its competitor from Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, which came out with this. As we can see, a lot more buttons, 4 face buttons, and then 2 on the shoulders here. You can see a little piece of tape to hold this one together because technology does break with enough time sometimes. Even Nintendo stuff from the 90s can break. It's possible. Then, a competitor appears. What do we have here? This is the Sony PlayStation 1 DualShock. 2 shoulder buttons, 4 face buttons, D-pad. Pretty standard at this point, at least from the Super Nintendo's set standard. But then 2 analog sticks. What's that all about? This was very novel at the time of its release, which I think was like 1998. Very novel. Games advance further, as we see. And then, of course, in 2005, we have the establishment of the gold standard for gamepads going forward, which was, yes, the Microsoft Xbox 360 controller. Very clean, very elegant, as we can see. Wireless, home button right on the front there, D-pad, 2 analog sticks, 4 face buttons. Click these down, you have an extra button there, hidden one. Never understood what L3 meant when I was a kid. I'll never forgive Tony Hawk Underground 2 for asking me to press L3 to enter focus mode when I don't know what L3 means. I look all over my controller, don't see anything. When did they expect to tell me this? I don't even know how I learned, to be honest. I still don't. L3 and R3 don't exist. And the 2 shoulder buttons with the analog triggers, which is, I think, quite standard nowadays, whereas on the PlayStation 2 controller, or PlayStation 1 controller, as I said, they do not have such things. Increasing complexity. This is the standard now. Packed with features. Tons of buttons. And we started from such humble beginnings as the Atari 2600 controller, 1 stick, 1 button. Games complexity increased with game controllers. Game controllers increased complexity with the complexity of the games they're associated with. That's it. This list is not exhaustive, of course, but it is chronological. I showed you that pretty much chronologically. The Game Boy Color was a little bit of a curveball, but it's the same as the original Game Boy, which came out in 1989. so, take it. It's easy to see what I'm meaning to communicate here, though. In only 2 decades, we went from the now primitive joystick plus button arrangement of the Atari 2600 to the complicated melange of buttons, sticks, and pressure-sensitive triggers that were the defining qualities of Microsoft's Xbox 360 controller. Intuitively, you can sense, if not materially see, the development of video games' complexity through these selections. Games needed more inputs, so here are more buttons on the face of your controller. The front gets crowded, so now we move buttons from the face to the shoulders. Games begin to incorporate 3D movements, so we begin to include analog sticks that allow for a full 360 degrees of circular motion in 3D space, as opposed to the 8 directions possible with the directional pad. With the development of the Nintendo Wii gamepad, the Nintendo Wii's gamepad, controlling a video game with bodily motion and pointer controls similar to a computer's mouse became available avenues of control consideration. Through this lens of interpretation, it's plain to see that the development of gamepad technology has been about the growth of options in the face of increasing sophistication. Console developers want desperately for their hardware to not ever be unsuited for any game experience, so the gamepad has become a canvas on which all features must be painted. This has had an interesting consequence for gamepads in the 21st century, and it's one which I will intend to illustrate here. I mentioned before that gamepads made a remarkable jump in the 2 decades between the Atari 2600 and the original Xbox. And in a way, I find it equally remarkable how little has changed since. This is what this hastily made chart is meant to illustrate. Nintendo, always attempting to push hardware beyond mere technical spec upgrades, has always been given to funky controller designs, be that the Wiimote and Nunchuck, the Wii U gamepad, or the function-heavy and mutable Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons. But what's special is that for all the aforementioned examples, the console also provided an alternative Pro controller model meant to emulate whatever Microsoft and or Sony were doing with their gamepads at that moment in time. It's a way to hedge bets and to temper complaints about the default idiosyncratic gamepad design. You don't like whatever screwiness Nintendo is doing with their default console gamepad? Get a more normal Pro controller and your problem is solved. And on top of that, Nintendo gets a few extra bucks from the consumer. It's a win-win. For Nintendo mostly. Microsoft and Sony have been hammering at the same gamepad ergonomics until it becomes a foregone conclusion what each company's gamepad will look like. Obviously, the Sony PlayStation DualShock, Sony's most unchanging and ubiquitous hardware peripheral, will be unchanged since its launch in 1997. Why mess with the formula? Why mess, in the opinions of fans, with perfection? The Xbox Duke, the original gamepad of Microsoft's original Xbox console, was one of the last times a widely released first-party gamepad was a real mistake. Derided as bulky, unwieldy, unsightly, and awkward, it was one of the rare times a company within the timeline of one hardware lifecycle had decided on a full controller redesign. This redesign replaced the Duke not 2 years after the launch of the Xbox. In 2005, Microsoft, adapting the principles laid out in the Duke and cleaning them up, led to the critically acclaimed, currently reigning gold standard in controller design, the Xbox 360 gamepad. As illustrated in the chart I showed you before, since then, they have not messed with the formula. I don't think about Microsoft as a game company very much. I think about the Duke a lot. In scanning around, I found this image of the Duke next to a standard gamepad for the Sega Dreamcast. There's a tinge of sadness to this image. These are holdovers from a lost era, some of the last gamepads to be widely circulated by their respective hardware's parent company that dared to some level of eccentricity with absolutely no contingency in their back pocket. The Duke was quickly discontinued and the Dreamcast lived a prosperous but brief North American shelf life of less than 2 years. The GameCube, my beloved, the GameCube also had the pluck to have a weird, wonderful gamepad, but it sold so badly as to cause Nintendo to change their entire hardware philosophy to place them out of direct technical competition with Microsoft and Sony. I don't think the lack of success of their consoles is due to their respective gamepad. That's reductive, but it was the last chance for outward quirkiness to reign before the PlayStation 2 sold 155 million copies and decided that gaming was going to be a fully, wholly, and totally mainstream now. The 6th generation of consoles was the last time weirdness without apology was allowed to thrive. I miss that. Maybe not every gamepad was perfectly adapted to every game experience, but damn it, there was personality. And with respect to this idea, let's address some love letters to these controllers that were so bursting with idiotic bluster that you cannot help but want to hug them. First of all, let's start with a predictable one. Look at this stupid boomerang. You know what people forget about this thing? How wide it is. It's like gripping a steering wheel in your hands. And what do they do with all of that? 3 buttons and a D-pad. 1 button more than the NES controller. Amazing respect to space efficiency. But the comfort and ergonomics of the controller are there. It feels like a sturdy piece of admittedly pretty old tech. And appropriately for the Sega Genesis, it has the feel in its buttons of the switches and triggers on a game cabinet, on an arcade cabinet. It's rough, it's limited, but it feels distinct to itself, and I appreciate that. Also, listen to that. Okay, that's good though. You can also hear my cat eating in the background, but that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. Later iterations of the Sega Genesis controller would introduce 3 additional face buttons and slim the grip a little bit, which is fine for producing greater versatility and maybe even increasing comfort, but I don't know. The redesign always smacked of a too little, too late correction. The Genesis was limited in its input in the face of the Super Nintendo, for sure, but most games on the console were built with these limitations in mind. Slapping 3 more face buttons on the controller is certainly a method of handling the issue, but it's a little bit slapdash and wasn't too widely adopted by software developers for fear of alienating those with only the original gamepad. So here we are staring face to face with a silly little gamepad from an entirely less serious time. On a side note, I recently discovered that the game Comics Zone uses the 6-button pad almost exclusively, and the game does not really work properly. I mean, it does work, but you're really hindering the gameplay experience by playing with this limited monstrosity. You really do want the 6-button pad for that, but I digress. I said limited software adoption, not none. Limited. Understand that. It's incredible that I've gotten this far without discussion of the Nintendo 64's infamous Trident head gamepad. History makes the context of this controller a little bit clearer, but it's like explaining how the infrastructural weakness of the Twin Towers allowed 9/11 to be the disaster that it was. In the end, you're just giving further context to terrorism. In the end, I think it's worth critiquing the N64 controller as a blunder, sure, but also to give it its due flowers. The Z button, located on the back, almost like the trigger of a gun, must be responsible for at least some of the success of GoldenEye and Perfect Dark as first-person shooters on the console, let alone Doom and Turok as well. You know, I'll throw Forsaken in there too. You know, I'll throw Doom 64 too. You know what? Controversial take. I'm gonna even throw South Park in there. Why did they make the South Park licensed game on the N64 a shooter, it's because we got this gun trigger in the back. That's not the reason. The reason is because GoldenEye sold like 5 trillion copies. And they were like, hey, let's get a little bit of that. And then they made a horrible video game where you throw snowballs at, like, elks or something. The analog stick, as given to failure as it may have been, like this one, proved its incredible level of sophistication to me only when I played the launch title Pilot Wing 64 from 1996 on it back in 2019. The smallest jostle of it would lead to a proportionally minute shift in my character's flight trajectory while using the glider or the plane. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask use the C buttons as item selects, which feels like an inspired alchemist transmutation of gold from coal. And changing the position of your hands on the gamepad, whether you're playing in 2D or 3D, is such a kooky idea that I do not think should be replicated, but I appreciate it having happened at least once. On top of that, playing Mischief Makers, game Mischief Makers, on the original N64 gamepad feels like the only way the game should be experienced. Navigating Marina with the D-pad while activating her jetpack thrusters in any direction with the C buttons is somehow even more inspired than Legend of Zelda's use of them. The D-pad feels pretty good too. It's absolutely massive for some. Look at the size of that beast right there. Can we get some context here? Look at that. It's you know, in the interest of transparency, I rarely use my original N64 gamepad anymore. That's what this is. This is the 1999 Jungle Green Donkey Kong 64 Special Edition Nintendo 64 gamepad that was released with Rare's Donkey Kong 64 in 1999. I guess I must have gotten that somehow. Great tribute to a great game, I guess. I don't use that thing anymore, in part because I broke this analog stick from playing Mario Tennis too hard. That's what happened. It's been that way forever. Instead, I do use the Retrobits Tribute 64 gamepad, which nicks the turtle shell look of the Sega Saturn 3D pad, which honestly is its own honorary little freak in our gallery of weirdos. I must say, this controller right here is fantastic. Alright, I know no one plays the Sega Saturn, I know no one cares about it, and I know even more so that no one plays with this thing. If they do, this rules. This was made for use with Nights into Dreams. It works with other games. This control stick is more comfortable than the Nintendo 64's control stick. And also, look at that. Analog trigger in 1996. You're telling me you got analog triggers. Sega, calm down. No one's buying the Sega Saturn. Can we please take a chill pill? Stop innovating. Calm down. Give it a few years. Despite my general abandonment of the original controller, I still harbor an affection for this original design. As much as the analog stick has come to frustrate me at times, if there's ever a game that I play that wants for the D-pad configuration, I'm compelled to return to this original. This is both a mark of genius in understanding how 2D games were not rendered obsolete by 3D games, but also a mark of complete idiocy in creating a controller that is so binary in its utility. Later controllers, and certainly the modern standard gamepad, is required to have functionality for both 2D and 3D games baked in. And that really began in earnest with the Nintendo 64. It just took a little bit of extra work to get through the bumps, to get the bumps in the execution sorted out. I give credits to the pioneers though, especially when that pioneer was so singular in its functionality within its time. As much as I want to give the flowers to this little guy over here, also released 1996, this and that are not the same thing. This is great, it's not the same thing. Not as sophisticated. I have controllers falling off my lap right now. I need some help. The enduring popularity of the Nintendo GameCube controller has almost made me want to discount it from the running here, but I simply have to spotlight how great this is, because it's obvious from just looking at it that greatness is not in following convention. The GameCube controller breaks just about every rule of symmetry, evenness, and functionality, and instead hones in entirely on ergonomics, comfort, and practicality. Outside of first-person shooters, which are best served by a mouse anyway, sorry. This is the perfect gamepad for playing games. The grooves in the plastic around the analog stick give emphasis on 8-directional movement while still providing full 360 motion. The irregular button and stick sizes are proportional to those buttons' respective importance and commonness of use. The analog triggers are still the best ever made and make Super Mario Sunshine and Metroid Prime notably more fun than they would be with lesser shoulder buttons. You heard the springs in there, gosh. The GameCube controller is funk in the right way. It's not the perfect gamepad in terms of making on-paper sense or working for every game ever made, but when it works, nothing is better. This syncopates like Bootsy. That's all I have to say about that. It's the best. Was there ever any doubt? The Sega Dreamcast gamepad is much like the console that hosts it. Wonky, quirky, super cool, loaded with features that were ahead of its time and utterly maladapted to the world it came into back in 1999. The pad in particular screams out for a second analog stick underneath the face buttons, but it just isn't there. I think such a change could have been a factor in helping facilitate a longer life for the Dreamcast, but more than likely, the result would have been just the same. But stripped of historical retrospect, we're left with this weird little huge gamepad. Plastic braille style bumps on the analog stick, an early instance of analog triggers, wire exiting the bottom of the gamepad, and 2 big slots on the top of it to insert memory cards that can display images in the middle of the controller. It's almost as though the Dreamcast did everything possible to make its controller wrong. Truth told, the controller is a hard sell, but I like it a lot. It feels entirely itself in almost every way, and how it feels is pretty good. Chunky buttons, big, thick grip, nice heft. Good stuff. And outside of Shenmue, surprisingly, which doesn't use the analog stick despite it being 3D, baffling that analog stick like looks around or something, and the absolute weirdness of FPSs on the Dreamcast, in my experience, most Dreamcast games meet the Dreamcast gamepad where it's at. It's chunky, but expressive, as far as a gamepad can be, at least. It's got spunk to do all of that. What is that exactly? Exist, mostly. But man, look how cool it is. Do you not think that's cool? Is there a better ambassador for Y2K aesthetics in the world of video game consoles than the Dreamcast? I think not, and I love it for that. You know why? In part because, yes, Some consoles were released in the year 2000 itself, which is literally Y2K, but Y2K belongs to 1999, and there is no more 1999 date than September 9th, 1999. That has nothing to do with this controller anymore, but we give it its flowers. The Wii Classic Controller Pro and its sleek handlebar design do not qualify like this little freak does. The Wii Classic Controller Original asks a vital question. What would happen if you took the Super Nintendo's traditional and effective gamepad and modernized it? Alternatively, it boldly proposes, what if the N64, but normal? It delivers only partially on both premises. The fact of the matter is that this little guy does not feel like the Super Nintendo gamepad. It should, it wants to, but it doesn't. It feels like goofy plastic, and in a classic move, it has the wire exiting the bottom instead of the top. Bless. The analog sticks are the true gaffe here. They're entirely too close together. And the stick on the right was meant to sub in for the C buttons on the N64 controller, and that just simply does not work. Once again, the N64's jank controller strikes its terroristic mayhem again. You simply can't emulate something that probably wasn't a great idea in the first place. All sorts of things about the Wii Classic Controller are quirked up. The first triggers are half-hearted analog, and the second triggers are tiny clinky buttons, and these analog triggers were actually removed for the second edition of this. You know why? Because no one cared and no games used it. The face buttons feel all kinds of soft and squishy. The thing does not work unless it is plugged into a Wiimote. The button on the top of the controller, which has no function at all except to maneuver a little bit of plastic in the back. This was intended for something at some point, but it never materialized. So in the original Wii Classic Controller, there lives the shadow of what could have been, complete with the text RVL-005, patent pending. Truly fascinating. If I am using the Wii Classic Controller, I use the original. Not necessarily because it's better, but because it's niftier. In the famous words of Marge Simpson, I just think it's neat. It brings a unique ergonomic feel. The closeness of the analog stick and Achilles heel on paper is one of the foundations of its character. Super Mario 64 never felt quite like it does on this Snickle Fritz. Would I prefer to use my Retrobit or even the original Nintendo 64 controller for the task? Probably. But the novelty factor of the Wii Classic Controller provides its own niche sort of appeal. And now finally we have an entry for one that I do not own. Sadly, I do not own it. The Duke. The original Xbox controller, the Duke, and how could I not include this? King of the Freaks, the final inheritor of the jank throne, the end-all and be-all of silly-ass gamepads, the original Duke. Maybe it's not the weirdest or worst controller ever, but it is certainly one of the weirdest to be distributed so widely and so modernly. In truth, I don't own a Duke because I don't own an original Xbox. If I had an original Xbox, I would use the Duke exclusively. My adoration for it is simply too great to even think to neglect it. I mean, look at this. A case study in missing the mark fabulously. The intention here was to make a normal gamepad. I can see that. They just didn't. The orientation of the buttons is weird. The D-pad, if you can even call it that, looks like a vague, melted piece of plastic, like an AI-generated image of what a D-pad should properly look like. The Xbox logo takes up a solid 20% of the controller's most valuable face real estate. What is normally the select button is labeled back. There are two white and black buttons without labeling as high up on the controller as physically possible before they start to fly out into space. That all aside, the sheer size of this lad is remarkable. There's little more to say for the Duke. Microsoft quickly abandoned it, but history will not forget it. It's one of the gamepads that's most on its face ridiculous while still being technically functional. As opposed to something like the Atari Jaguar controller, it announced itself loud, and they slunk out the back door before the party was even half over. There are more that could be mentioned, especially if I wanted to delve into the pre-NES world, but I'll let these 6 selections speak volumes of the nature of my affection. I appreciate that which flies the freak flag, and it's a flag we don't see flying from too many major gaming peripherals anymore. Why is that? It might just be that games grew up. Gaming has become indescribably rich as a medium. To those cultural stenographers not keen on measuring the minutest pulses of artistic ambition of games from the Super Nintendo on, the worlds presented in games like Red Dead Redemption 2, The Witcher 3, and The Last of Us may come as a surprise. The cinematic, dramatic, narrative, and aesthetic ambitions of games extend even to the works of smaller development teams, let alone the expectation of prestige that comes with a large company name attached. Arguments from times past about the validity of video games as an artistic medium seem almost hopelessly out of step with reality. The proof is almost inalienable. Throw a stone in the direction of any Game of the Year list from the last decade, and you'll likely find something of meaningful artistic distinction. This is all to say that games have reached their maturation. Most people play games, even if casually, and every self-referenced gamer of any worth has a small cache of games whose artistic value they uphold as a paragon of the medium, whether that's something as dusty as Myst or as shiny and new as Baldur's Gate 3. But almost organically, as a result of this, gaming has few places left to grow. Not since 1998 has 3D gaming been revelatory. Not since 2003 have open worlds been novel. Not since 2009 have moral choice systems been obscure, and the question of when quality video game narratives became something at least reasonably common is the subject of at least some debate, the only settled question of the debate being that it has at least happened by now. I love and cherish many games of the last decade, but their groundbreaking qualities are slim at best. Inventive, certainly, but ground can only be broken once. In turn, their caution and attention to detail grows in its magnitude until I assume even indie studio toss-offs of a certain caliber will glimmer with a polished sheen that would make any given PS2 game weep. Games on the whole are arguably better than they were 20 years ago. Games on the whole are also arguably infinitely less interesting than 20 years ago. There's an obvious something, an indescribable je ne sais quoi that comes with being formative. For however thoroughly a thing gets iterated on, there is a spark that is achieved, knowingly or not, through breaking ground. This is why, despite the fact that I do, in the pure facts and numbers sort of sense, prefer 2017's A Hat in Time to Banjo-Kazooie, I would count the latter as more fascinating. One is pure iteration, however beautifully done. The other maintains its off-the-shelf freshness even 26 years later, despite the obvious hallmarks of age, that spirit, intangible and inimitable. A spirit that Banjo-Kazooie's spiritual successor, ukulele, lacked, by the way. The comfortable maturation of the game's medium yields many meaningful dividends. Games look better, run better, regularly exercise artistic muscles, and do not shy away from pretension as readily as the time period that saw this cover change for Ico's North American localization. Just look at it. They did this. It's one of the greatest crimes against art of the 21st century, and I wish I was joking with you, but you could put the one on the left up in a museum. I wouldn't even want to own a copy of the thing on the right, and Eco is a great game. I digress. But in spirit, what can lay claim to being Eco but Eco? Eco is not great in a vacuum alone. It is great because it dared what it dared in the naggingly bro-ish gaming culture of 2001. Not 2023, not even 2007, but 2001. Its daringness is as integral to its identity as its hold hands with Yorda button. To cut a potentially eternal digression short, games had more chutzpah back in the day. Note, I don't say better designed, I don't say prettier, I don't even say more inventive, but chutzpah is the order of the hour in times of becoming. Gaming isn't really becoming anymore, not so far as I can see. Quality as people say 2023 was regarding video games, the nominee list for Game of the Year saw nothing but iteration. And within that framework, minor innovations, I'm sure. But this slowing of progress is natural. It's simply not sustainable to good health to keep the rate of change of a teenager up into one's 30s. Similarly, games have slowed their rate of change down and are now free to reap the benefits of 40 years of gameplay design knowledge and create some solid quality video games. And the gamepad, the mediator of the experience, has settled in a similar fashion, solid but lacking chutzpah. We're not looking at a future of Dukes and Dreamcasts. We're likely going to see the same general gamepad tendencies we've been seeing for over a decade now, and should an aberration come along, it's likely to be turned on so violently as to be scrapped before reaching market. Such was the fate of the vaporous original PS3 Boomerang controller, debuted in 2005 but never publicly released. And here the fate of the future spun on its curvy form. As we must put to rest the tumult of our adolescence, so too should we accept that the Boomerang was probably a dumb idea that was wise to never put to market. But if there's something that my life hence lived has proven, it's that the spirit of teenagehood is wasted on the teenager. And as important as it is to stabilize, so too is it important to carry the spark of imagination and inspiration that characterizes the very brightest of the adolescent experience. Maybe gaming will never produce more freak gamepads like it did in the past, at least not in scale. And I can accept that, but that doesn't mean I have to be celebrating its stodgy adulthood like it is perfect progress either.
What's up, nerd? Thank you for staying till the end of the video. I know it was a lot of ranting and raving by a potentially unwell human being, just kind of going off for a while, but I promise you, 90% of that was scripted. I wrote most of that out, which, now that I'm actually thinking about it, makes it seem actually even more unwell. But you know what? It's all good because it's done now and I can't go back. Look, guys, please comment. Please like. Please subscribe. I want to see comments more than anything. You know why I want to see comments? Because my last video, the Matilda video, the video before my last video, which was the Night in the Woods video, was my Matilda video, which got over 1,000 views. Most views I've ever gotten on this platform. turn the comments off automatically. Just automatically turn them. I don't know how to appeal it. I don't play with YouTube in that way. I don't know what to do. I think they were like, this is children's media. Go to hell. Come on. But yes, in short, please do the engagements. It is appreciated. And as a little bonus for staying till the end, you get to see a severely haggard, messed up version of Delita. Like, my normally pristine presentation would not allow this kind of atrocity to occur, but you're getting it right now. I can barely freaking talk, man. There it is. Take care till next time. Delita out.